We had gone through, of course, a lot of the story of Moshe and the Brit Milah, and I'm sure you saw the movie about the Exodus, so I don't have to talk to you about it. And besides, with the Haggadah coming up and Pesach, you're going to know it even well. I'm taking another point. I want to take, again, a rather well-known story, which, when we go into the text, we say, oh, yeah, I never saw it that way. That's what we like to do. What I like to do to show you what the text is saying and perhaps why Chazal gave it a little tweak here and there. And that is, as I said, Israel's journey from freedom to independence. Obviously, the freedom from Egypt, but independence only once they get into their own land. Okay? So, the beginning of that, we find in Bishalach, nation has been freed. The Egyptians are no longer treading water in the Red Sea, not the Dead Sea. But anyway, Israel has been freed from that. Yetziat Mitzrayim has come true. Bnei Israel have marched triumphantly, but into the unknown, actually. That's what the Parsha of Shalach is about and how it starts. But before all of the events of what takes place, the Torah gives us a sort of, introduction, I suppose, before we hear of the events. I'm actually jumping ahead of myself, so I apologize when I told you that already the Egyptians are drowning in the sea. They aren't yet. In other words, out of Egypt, not even yet at the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, Yam Suf. They haven't got there. That's more precise as what I'm talking about at this point. So there they are. And the introduction that we are told in the beginning of the Parsha, Vayihi b'shalach paro et Adam, it's the first source that you have, where it says, when Paro sent away, right? When Paro sent away the people, Hashem did not lead them by way of the Eretz Plishtim, the land of the Philistines, because even though it was the shorter, because it was the shortest route. There are different before sure what that means, but because that land of the Philistine was a shorter route, because he said that people might change their minds, and when they encounter war, they would return to Egypt. And so Hashem led them roundabout by way of the Reed Sea desert, okay? Yam Suf, Hamidbar Yam Suf. That is how it begins. By the way, they got out of Egypt. They're now going to Eretz Israel, to the then known as the land of Canaan. To do so, as you can see in the map, well, so there's no map. But anyway, the way to go from Egypt to Israel, even today, the shortest way, if you're going to be walking, or if you have your friendly donkey or camel, is to go right up the shore, the sea. You go right up along the Mediterranean Sea. That's Derech Eretz Plishtim. The Philistines, they actually lived there. They inhabited that area that we now call Gaza, because the city of Gaza was a Philistine city, and they actually settled there. Not to go into details, but they actually had come from Cyprus. They had come from the island off of and they came and they conquered the people there, and they came from outside, and they then settled the area along the shore, along the sea coast, and that was called Eretz Plishtim.
Which island is in
The land,
Which island?
it is. I think it was Cyprus. I think it was Corsica. Yeah, I think it was Cyprus. Yeah. The Kaftor it was called. Plishtim Kaftor in Hebrew is called Kaftor. And you find that actually in Amos that God took the Plishtim Kaftor. They took the Plishtim from Kaftor and had them settle in Eretz Israel and Eretz Canaan. At any rate, that's the easiest way to go. If you want to go straight, it's not a big deal. It's a couple of days journey. Okay, you have 2-3 million people. It'll take a little longer. But that's the shortest way. So what are we told here? And was that God said it's not a good idea to take the short way. Why? Because he knows the Jews. And if they see a war, if they see any problems, they're probably going to demonstrate and block the traffic. And they're not going to be allowed. They said, we don't want to go and see a war. These are slaves. So a week ago, they were slaves, and now going to fight a war. So eventually, when the Egyptians come, of course, God says, I'll fight for you, because they're not capable of it. So if they go that way, he feels that they would be frightened, and they're going to say, let's forget about it and go back to Egypt. Not wanting the Israelites, his nation, to just give up when they see war, when they're confronted with an army that would stop them from going into the land, they might go back. So God says, not a good place. So therefore, he took what basically is a roundabout way. Instead of going straight up the sea coast, which would be obviously north, probably just almost directly north, he turned to eastward. It goes to Derech Eretz, and therefore, that's what it says. That's what they did. Vayasev Elokim Edaham. He turned them around from going to north, which was a logical thing, to go to the east, at least southeast almost, to avoid that route to Eretz Israel. That's the simple explanation of the Torah as to why they didn't go straight into Eretz Israel, but they had to go around a little bit. And as simple as that is, it makes absolutely no sense. And let me explain to you why it makes no sense. Just consider. First of all, the reason why God said, I'm going to take them on a roundabout, a circuitous route, is in order to avoid any war, and want to therefore return to Egypt. Okay? And this fear of hen yinachem really means to regret. They regret to change their mind. They would regret having left Egypt. That's the whole reason. Pen yinachem ha'am. Maybe they would regret that they had left Egypt when they see a war, and therefore they would turn around, okay? And that's how most of the Mefarshim, most of the commentators explain that this is what the Torah is saying. Rashi, even his grandson, who is primarily I always say Doreh Pshat, the one who often disagrees with Rashi, but this time he agrees with his Zaidi. And even the Rambam, the great of the halachists, also sees this. It's what the problem is. And by choosing the circuitous route, going around by Yisov, and not a direct route to the promised land, they would, admittedly, they would delay their arrival into the land, and there'd be a better possibility that the people would not feel as strong a connection to Egypt, and they would adapt a little bit to the desert and see themselves doing things by themselves. They weren't being told by slave masters what to do, and they'll be a little more independent, and they won't be looking to run back to Egypt. Good. And also, perhaps they would also feel a little more capable of fighting and facing a military confrontation. So that's good. That was the logic of, according to what these Meforshim say, these commentaries, God's logic as to why he did not take the direct route, but rather went roundabout. But when we take even the simplest analysis, the logic just falls apart. Again, put it into a test of logic. Does this make sense? Let's see. God takes the whole nation a roundabout route towards the Red Sea, okay, to avoid war. And there would then, the reluctant temptation to go back to Egypt and not to go out. Okay, so tell me, how well did that work? That worked good, God, right? That they didn't want it out now because it went roundabout, didn't have any problems. Let's look at the. I think it's the third. Is it the third? Yeah, the third source. I'll start with one verse beforehand, where it says that the Egyptians began to pursue the fleeing slave of the Israelites, and they caught up to them as they were right on the shores of the Red Sea, and they came not simply by themselves. They came kol sus v'rechav paro, all of the horses and chariots. Please be aware, in the ancient world, before the cowboys, the horses were not this type of thing. They used camels, and they used of course, the beasts of burden, that is the donkeys. Horses were used by this time. They finally got them. Originally they weren't used. They were wild horses. They began to train them for war. Horses were primarily a war. Their tanks of that time were the horses and chariots. Sus verach vokvo. Right. So at any rate, they're all chasing chasing the Israelites. And listen to what it says. Now I'm getting to the source, okay? Where it says Ufaro ikriv, and in the English, okay? Pharaoh drew near, and Bnei Israel looked up and beheld the Egyptians coming after them. Oh, they were very frightened. And they cried out to Hashem. What did they say? They said to Moshe, well, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you took us out of into the desert to die and be there? What have you done bringing us out of Egypt? That's the exact thing we told you us in Egypt when we told you, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians, because it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. What do they want to do when they see the Egyptians fighting them? What do they want to do? Help me out here. What did they say? What do we want to do? They want to go back to Egypt. They want to go back to Egypt. Why'd you take us out of Egypt? It's better to stay there. So God took them around a circuitous route, because if, God forbid, you might have a war, you're going to want to go back to Egypt. So I'll send you by the Red Sea. And what happened? The Egyptians chased them, ready to attack them and have a war with them. And they said, we want to go back to, and they said we should go back to Egypt. So there's this wonderful expression that he says, Chachamim, maho il b'tak kantam. "Oh, rabbis, what have you succeeded to do with your plan here? God, what did you accept?" According to what our Mefarshim say, the whole reason to take them in a roundabout route is so that they won't have to deal with, confront with a military power and then want to go back to Egypt. And what happens? They were confronted with the military power and they wanted to go back to Egypt. Exactly what supposedly God was trying to avoid. So logically, to say that was the whole reason that God wanted really does not fly in the face of logic. It just is simply. So that's the first thing. They get through the problem of the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, as it should be spoken to. A Suf is the reed. When Moshe is found on the side of the river, and when he's in his little basket floating on the river, it says that al-Hasuf, he's on the reeds of the river. So it means a reed, Yam Suf. Anyway, they get through that. And what happens? Nebuch, they're complaining they haven't got water, they haven't got food, they haven't got water. And what happens? They're attacked by Amalek. What? The Amalekites attack them. But God missed his ways. It wasn't working. You're trying to avoid war. You take them on a route to avoid the war, and you get to the Amalekites, Amalekim, and they are attacked and they have a war. And again, I ask the question, why? It makes no sense that God would really want to avoid any war, which would make them want to go back to Egypt. But he ended up having one attack, almost attack, of the Egyptians, and they started to cry they wanted to go back to Egypt. And then to avoid a war, well, they had a war anyway, just a few weeks later with Amalek. So why'd you take them that way? Do you hear why I'm telling you what we thought as, oh, we know the story, it's very nice. It really isn't very clear. There's a very strong argument made by really one of the pioneers in understanding the text of Torah that we are blessed to have, Baruch Hashem, till now, of Yoel ben Nun. And he challenges us with that. So we have to understand what was really happening here. If God really wanted this, why doesn't God take them out of harm's way? I mean, he knows pretty much everything, so why not take them around where they would not be attacked? If that, after all, was God's fear, the war they would have against the Egyptians are understandable. They would be afraid of them. The Egyptians was a huge, after all, empire. They had a tremendous military. The Philistines were far less of a threat, I would imagine, and yet he's trying to avoid the Philistines. It's just very difficult. It should have been easier for God to say, you know what? I'll worry about the Philistines later on, but let's get them into their own country where they can be settled down and have their own army, and they'll be able to be great. So that's the first real problem. The second problem is not logic, but it's contradictory. I don't know if you all remember the events that occur at Har Elohim, right? The mountain of God, which, as we all know, was Har Sinai. But it was called the mountain of God, yet because it would seem in the ancient world it was considered a holy mountain for whatever reason. And that's where God appears to Moshe in the burning bush. That's what is Har Elohim Mechoreva. What does he do there? He has an argument with Moshe, and one of the arguments he says to Moshe, to prove to him that everything will be fine and he'll be able to take the Israelites out of Egypt and he'll be fine, is he tells Moshe in our fourth source. The source is a source, of course.
It's number 4.
That's the fourth one, number 4. He says to Moshe, trying to convince him and to prove to him that he would be successful in taking the Jews, Israelites, out of Egypt. He says, when you take them out, you'll see, this is the sign that you'll be successful. And here it comes. This is the sign that I will be with you. This is the proof that I have sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will serve Elohim, you'll serve God on this very mountain. So he's telling them, when you leave Egypt, where are you going to go to worship? After all, what did the argument did Moshe give to Paro? And he told the people also, we want to leave Egypt in order to worship God. Okay? He said that. He said, let my people go. I mean, before the spiritual. But so that we can worship God. And God had told Moshe the very thing. You will worship me where? Har Elohim. Meaning, when you come out of Egypt, you will worship me at Har Sinai. Har Sinai wasn't what Derech Eretz pleased him. From the very beginning, Moshe was told by God, and God knew very well, that he was going to take them towards Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai was not north of where, from Egypt and where they were leaving. Mount Sinai was indeed very much east, a little bit south, and it comes up towards Saudi Arabia more. So what are you talking me about? Oh, God really wanted to take them that. No, he didn't. He didn't want to take them that way. He told them he wouldn't be taking them that way. This whole story here is very difficult to understand. The whole reasoning is very difficult to understand. It's not logical because, as I pointed out to you, Bnei Israel anyway wanted to go back to Egypt when the Egyptians were attacking them, and they didn't avoid any war because they eventually had the war against Amalek. So God did not solve the problem that supposedly he was supposed to be solving. This is what we really have a problem. And that's why it's important to go and see this. So let's understand. While this is going on, while the Israelites are suffering in Egypt, in servitude, every one of them, where was Moshe? In Midian, correct. He was in Midian. And because of that, he knew the desert fairly well. I mean, he did manage to cross the desert from Egypt into Midian. Again, it's that invisible map that I have you, that they go from west to east, from Egypt across eastward, across the desert, and that's where, and the north, actually northeast, and that's where Midian is.
Where is it nowadays?
Nowadays, it's Jordan. Okay, partially Saudi Arabia and Jordan, right over there. That's where he went. In fact, now there's even a controversy where Har Sinai really is. But at any rate, nobody knows for sure. You get different books, some fascinating books, some written by archaeologists, some by Christian biblical people who claim, and I read this book, very interesting, that they found a mountain in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabians would not allow them at the time, about 30 years ago, to get near him. It was all fenced off, but they found from outside supposedly proof of where it says that Israel had built 12 mizbachot, altars, outside of Har Sinai, and that they put away their jewelry and stuff. And God said, get rid of them at the sin of the calf. They claimed they saw it, and they found much of it there. And they claimed that it was in Saudi Arabia, actually. And when they said physically, that's where 2 million people could stand around it. There was enough room there. The problem is timing-wise, whether there was enough time. Yeah, I'm not going to go into that, but there is a controversy exactly where Har Sinai is. Remember, the Christians also had it. I think they had not a nunnery, but the monks were up in the mountain in the desert, in Sinai Desert, and said this was Har Sinai. Whatever. Moshe, again, so he knew the way in the desert, okay? And Moshe had been told, remember, when he was talking to a burning bush, that he would be bringing Bnei Yisrael to Har Sinai. And he knew what Har Sinai was because he was standing there. And he knew it was not north towards Eretz Plishtim. So he also knew that they would be going that way. Okay? He wasn't really going the coast of the Mediterranean, which is where the Eretz Plishtim is. Not the Via Mare, it's called the Via Mare, which is the route of the sea route. Okay? So he knew that very well. So what does it mean when God changed this route? Well, if we clearly said he didn't change anything, he had planned to do it this way in the first place. It was always his plan. And to understand this well takes us somebody like Rav Yoel Ben Nun, who was also much of if not archaeologist, he's a very expert in ancient Near East, ancient Middle East. And he explained something of his studies. Okay? First, we have to start with what was God's real target? What did he want? Did he want them to be able to avoid war, or did he want the people to be truly free? He wanted them to have freedom. So Rav Ben Nun suggested that if you have an opportunity to check out an article in the 1920 Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, you probably have it in your bookcase someplace. Just 100 years ago. Anyway, it was a book written, by the way, by a British fellow by the name of James Wilson. Did you ever hear about the Wilson Arch right outside of the old city? You should know. You go there and you have a tourist. You'll say, "Oh, this is Wilson's Arch over here. It's where they went into the city because they had to go on top." Anyway, at any rate,
Is it still there?
huh? Wilson's Arch, yeah, you can see it, yeah. Wilson isn't still there, but the arch is.
So which part of the area is it?
I'll have to get a tour guide. I'll tell you which ones of the arches is the Wilson's Arch. It's right by the wall of Yerushalayim, of the Chamot Yerushalayim, right outside. Wilson's Arch. I don't know exactly which one. But as I said, any good tourist guide, if my cousin were here, he would give us wonderful. I have a cousin who is an outstanding tour guide, specifically of Yerushalayim, and he has an encyclopedic memory of Yerushalayim itself, and he would be able to tell you if he's standing here right now. But he's not. He's he's back worrying about his sons in the army. But anyway, he wrote ancient texts, and he wrote in the ancient texts, I should say, and subsequent archaeological discoveries that were done in what we call the Eretz Plishtim, the coastal route. The coastal route was what's known in the Torah as Derech Eretz Plishtim, the route of the land of the Philistines. What we're talking about. And the archaeologists have looked into this yet over 100 years ago, and they found out from different archaeological findings that it basically, although the Philistines lived there, it was under the control of, guess who? Egypt. Egypt was a huge empire. Egyptian had subdivided people who were living elsewhere, probably in Canaan also, but they were under the control of Egypt. They may not be enslaved by them, probably had to pay taxes, but they were the ones who controlled it. More than that, we know from the diggings in TORAH, which is near Rafah, the archaeologists there uncovered a series of Egyptian military bases. These bases that were under the control of the pharaohs, and they were underground. This is a very scary thing, given today's truth, that it was under the ground in Gaza. They had underground 40 to 50 feet underground desert fortification. And there they found sweet flowing water. I don't have to remind you. Do you know our wonderful cousins in Gaza today and where they were? Underground in tunnels 40, 50 feet down, if not more. So modern biblical commentaries, not one of our Meforshim, they said that such a route would actually plunge the Israelites into a military trap. They're not going up to Derech Eretz Plishtim because it was under Egyptian military control. If it's under Egyptian military control, what do? They would be running away from Egypt to be caught in Egypt by Egypt. And therefore, that's why God went to the southern route, the southeastern route, to avoid them getting through the military bases of the Egyptian armies over on the coastal road. Coastal road was the easiest way to go, but it was controlled by Egypt. And that's why God says, no, we have to not go that way. Problem is, that's not what the Torah says. The Torah says, Pen yinachem ha'am birotam milchama. I was afraid that the people would get frightened and panicked when they're confronted with war, right? And they'd want to go back to Egypt. They had to, therefore, avoid war, according to what the Torah is telling us, not for fear they're going to be defeated, but rather for the fear of being ambushed and trapped. Not even that, but rather because B'Shavua Mitzrayim, because they were going to want to go back to Egypt. It would seem they would return to Egypt.
But if it was controlled by Egypt, Egypt could capture them and take them back.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying. We are believing, we're understanding that, they're complaining, they're going to want to go back to Egypt. But perhaps, as Rabbi Nun says, that's not what it means. That when it says, Shavu Mitzrayim, not that they would return to the land of Egypt, but rather having been going into the Egyptians and in their military thing, they would look to Egypt for aid and for help. In other words, it's true in the ancient world that Egypt had many nations or cities, really city states, that were under their control. They allowed them to continue, but they paid them taxes and they controlled them. And the fear was, according to Rav Ben, that Israel would return not to Egypt itself, but to Mitzrayim, to Egypt as a power, that they would now become dependent upon the powerful Egyptian empire. What does God want to do more than anything else? Freedom. To get out, to remove the yoke of Egyptian servitude. Even if they won't be slaves per se, they would end up being serving Egypt for whatever person, whether it's taxes or anything. And when they have a problem and they're going to have somebody maybe attack them and they're going to have real tsuras, what are they going to do? Are they going to go to the shul and say Tehillim? Or are they going to go to the pharaohs and say, help us? That's what God wanted to avoid. Freedom would mean independence for them. And that would mean you cannot rely on Egypt. And it's the most obvious and the most clearly logical thing that a people that were enslaved by them and were used to hundreds of years of being told what to do and what not to do, that even if they go away and they're not going to schlep them back all the way back to Egypt, they would say, fine, you can stay there and we'll tell you what to do. And they would say, thanks a lot. A fear that the state of Israel has had forever, even to this day. They always wanted to be independent. And even with the wonderful friends that we have now, there's still a fear that, is that going to mean that once we're going to rely on them, they can then tell us what they should do and should not do? I didn't say it, you did, but that's exactly a fear. It's not happening yet, it doesn't seem, but maybe a little it is. And is that good or bad for the Jews? So that's the whole point, he says. It wasn't that he's afraid that, let's run back to the Egyptians. In a certain degree, it is. He's afraid that they would, even if they got away from the specific slavery of Egypt, they would still be under the servitude of the Egyptians and the Egyptian empire, who would then think, and that's not really free, certainly not independent. And that's what God was trying to avoid. And that is why it says, Vayasev Elokim et ha'am derech hamidbar yam suf. That's why it says that he now has them going toward Yam Suf. It wasn't that he changed his mind of going that way. He knew exactly what is going to happen. God doesn't have to change his mind. He always planned to go to Har Sinai and so on and so forth. But the whole reason why he didn't want to go the direct route is because he changed that route on purpose to go to Har Sinai and so on and so forth to avoid any Egyptian power or control of the area. So why would he go to Yam Suf? Obviously, the Egyptians were ready to run after them, and they figured they could attack them. They were able to take a whole army in there. They probably had control there. So why does he do it? What happens at Yam Suf? No, splitting the sea is fun. Makes a great movie. But what happened at Yam Suf after it split? He drowned all the army. He had to have Israel see that the great Egyptian army and the great power and the military and so on and so forth, they're no longer there. You think you're going to rely upon Egypt? Then nobody like this, God says, I can get rid of them. And they had to see that. If you recall what we say every morning, when we say the Az Yashir, Vayar Yisrael et Mitzrayim meit al Svat Hayam. There's one little verse which didn't seem so important. It said, and Israel saw the Mitzrayim, Egypt, die, dead at the sea. Why is that so important? Yes, because that's exact. And it wasn't even, it doesn't say, Vayayu et HaMitzrim. He saw the Egyptians were dead. He said, Egypt was dead there. The fear they had of Egypt and the fear of the great power of Egypt, that's what died at Yam Suf. And that's why God wanted them by Derech HaMidbar Yam Suf. It doesn't say Derech HaMidbar to Har Sinai or Derech HaMidbar to this. No, Derech HaMidbar Yam Suf, because he's got to put them at Yam Suf so that the Egyptians would be following them and they would be drowned at Yam Suf. That was the plan. That's what God did. By Yisrael, that he turned them around to go to Yam Suf. So that even though Egypt still had some control there, they would all die there. You all see them there. That would put an end to it. Or so God believed should happen. And it should have happened. And we'll see it didn't. But at least the fear of Mitzrayim was really, really destroyed. The confrontation of Egypt and the Egypt's army at Yam Suf, Sus v'rochvo Rama vayam. Sus, the horse, and the chariots, the tanks, were thrown into the sea. That was so. It wasn't just they were dead. Their power, their military power was best seen by chariots. I got to tell you, I can't go through Tanakh all the way with you now, but I can show you what the tank force, how important that was in the ancient world. Israel didn't have a tank force. That's why the Canaanites attacked them, Yavin, and their tanks, meaning their horses and chariots, were drowned in the river in the north. I'm not going to go through the Parak Dalet in Shoftim. That's where it is. Nachal Kishon. But Israel didn't have that. I can go through with Philistines and stuff like that. And Israel didn't have that type of military for quite a while after that. So the destruction of Sus v'rochvo, as we're told, of the chariots and the horses, was more than symbolic of the complete destruction of the power of Egypt, which is what God wanted, so that they would now rely not upon Egypt. And what is the last word that said after it says they saw Egypt dead and Egypt gone? Vayaminu b'Hashem u'Moshe abdo. Now they really believed in God. They knew they had. It's not even believed in. They now had faith in. They now had faith in God. They now would rely on God, and not on, don't worry, the Egyptians will come and they'll help us out. That's essential for a Israelite nation to become its own nation. That's what they saw. And just as show you precisely the mindset of the Israelites at this time. Okay? In source number 5, we find that the Israelites, that God gives the plan to Moshe of what he wants. It says, the Amar Parah de Israel. He tells Moshe, you know what's going to happen? Parah was going to say about the Israelites, Nivuchim heim ba'aretz. They don't know where they're going, man. Their ways is broken. They're stuck in front of the Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea, the Yam Suf. They're lost. They don't know. What do they know about going into a desert? No one's going to lead them. What do they know? So they're going to see that you're stuck in front of Yam Suf, he said, that they're confused in the land. The desert has trapped them. When that happens, God tells Moshe, I will harden the heart of Paro and he will pursue them. That's what I wanted to do. And I will be glorified through Paro and his entire army. Ikavda b'Pharaoh. A great play on words. Ikavod, kaved means heavy. I will deal heavily, but that's not what it means. It's from the word kavod. I will be glorified when my rough, the way I treatment, the rough treatment of the Egyptians there, and they will know that I am Hashem. There it is. That's exactly what he wants. If I defeat the Egyptians and the Israelites see them being defeated, drowning on the Red Sea, on the Yam Suf, then they will now see Egypt is dead, as it were. They will know that I am Ham. I am the power. I'm the one they're going to go to Tehillim for. I'm the one who can help them. That's what had to be done. What should I say? It's an old cigarette commercial, but you're not allowed to have it anymore. We used to always say it, but we say it differently. You can take Israel out of Egypt, but they had to take Egypt out of Israel. They had to remove from Israel their idolizing, a terrible word to use, of Egypt. But they're so strong, but they're so we can't fight them. That type of thing. God had to destroy that. How does he do it? He lets them see that all of the Egyptians and the army is destroyed at Yam Suf. And that's why, again, I go back to the wording where it says, Vayar Yisrael et Mitzrayim met al Svat Hayam. Israel sees Egypt is dead. Not the Egyptians. Egypt is. The concept of Egypt. The power of Egypt.
Where's that first, please? Vayar, which you said there.
So as I was saying, that is a crucial thing. It shows that God was not fearful of necessarily them going back to Egypt, but rather seeing Egypt as their saviors, and that when things went rough, they would go to them. And I'm going to show you why this is a real problem. Okay, I'll show you that and why they needed. God needed a final confrontation against Egypt for the Israelites to understand that that is that they are gone, and that's why still in the fifth source, that second part of it, that Moshe tells that to the people. Moshe said to the people, don't be afraid. Stand firm. You'll see the deliverance of God that God will perform for you today. For the Egyptians that you have seen today, you will never see again forever. That's what he's telling them. They're gone. Their power will be gone. That's what he had to tell the people. That's what they had to be completely convinced of, that they need not have them and they will need not go back to Egypt, or at least rely on them for any aid and for any help and any protection. There's only one, and that's God, who will be their aid and their protection. That is extremely important. And that is exactly why this whole thing of going around and not going straight That's why it was done. It was done not for fear of them going back to the land of Egypt, but going back to Egypt, the empire, as their support and their strength. And we're going to go on yet to show you how it was a very real thought for Israel, especially those opening years when they're in the Egypt, when they're in the desert, of wanting to go to Egypt for what they wanted for it, to going back to Egypt, going back to Egypt. It's still ringing in their ears about Egypt, Egypt. And when we eventually get to the story of the spies and the story of the punishment, right, of Israel having to die in the desert, when you understand God's concern that they're going to, they see Egypt as their help, and that it's a realization that a nation that has been enslaved for so long in Egypt is a nation that could not build another independent country, state. And that's why a new non-slave generation would have to come and take over. But we're not going to get into it now. Okay, so Mirza Hashem, next week, and we'll have to tell the people that if you didn't take this, they can find it on the over here on the what's called on the site.